The so-called strategic bombing campaign is definitely one of the darkest and most overlooked aspects of the Second World War. Today, we're going to show you why through things you didn't know, so that by the end, with the full picture, you'll understand just how brutal it was, affecting everyone from the airmen inside bombers to the people on the ground, and everything in between. Let's begin. The horrors of strategic bombing actually began when Germany's Luftwaffe demonstrated what large-scale aerial attacks could do, obliterating dozens of cities early in the war. In 1940 alone, the Luftwaffe dropped over 41,000 tons of bombs on cities like London, Warsaw and Rotterdam, killing and displacing tens of thousands of civilians. But the Allied bombing campaign would soon make what the Luftwaffe had done seem like nothing, as they dropped an estimated 2.7 million tons of bombs on Europe, followed by 650,000 tons in the Pacific, and finally, the 2 atomic bombs, when traditional bombing wasn't enough. Bombing operations escalated significantly with the Allied effort to disrupt German forces in Europe, aiming to weaken their ability to wage war in preparation for the ground invasion that would follow. Joint US and British long-range bombers flew from England over Western Europe, delivering devastating bomb payloads to the most important military targets in German-held territories. At least, that was the plan. In practice, however, this campaign would spark controversy that remains to this day, and you'll see why in a moment. The British and Americans agreed on sustained around-the-clock bombings, with the British bombing by night and the Americans by day, each utilizing their own tactics and methods. The Americans wanted to use daylight for more precise bombing with their Norden bombsight, which was said to be capable of putting a bomb into a pickle barrel. Well, that couldn't have been further from the truth. Although daylight missions did improve accuracy since crews could see their targets, they also put bombers in great danger from enemy anti-aircraft defenses and especially interceptor fighters. Daylight bombing was also intended to reduce collateral damage and civilian casualties, at least in theory, as long as civilians weren't being deliberately targeted. The British, on the other hand, having suffered under the Luftwaffe's bombing raids and flying bombs that harassed their cities, saw nothing wrong with bombing German cities and civilian targets just as they did military ones. Their focus was less on crippling Germany's war industry and more on breaking the morale of the German population. In reality, both bombing strategies caused immense civilian deaths, as only 14% of bombs actually hit their intended targets. Later in the war, this improved to 44%, but the bombardier's aim could still be thrown off by weather, enemy fire, or simply faulty intelligence and misidentified targets. Now let's go step by step, showing you each aspect of the bombing campaigns, getting progressively more disturbing, so that by the end of the video, you'll have a complete picture. Let's start with the bombers, their crews, and the bombs they used. The workhorse bomber for the Americans was the famous B-17 Flying Fortress with a maximum payload of 8,000 pounds. However, this was usually less, depending on how far the target was and how much fuel was needed. Alongside it was the consolidated B-24 Liberator, which had a greater range and could carry a heavier payload. The British relied on the Avro Lancaster, designed for high-capacity area bombing, with an enormous payload for the time of 14,000 pounds and up to 22,000 pounds maximum when carrying specialized bombs like the Tallboy, Grand Slam, or bouncing bombs used in special missions. The Handley Page Halifax was also widely used by the British, while the B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber of the war, would see action in the Pacific, conducting long-range bombings and ultimately dropping the atomic bombs. Most often, payloads consisted of high explosive bombs, usually ranging from 500 to 1,000 pounds, though there were 12 and even 22,000 pound specialized bombs. While these caused severe structural destruction, the real horror came from incendiary bombs. These contained magnesium or thermite and later napalm, which burned at extreme temperatures of up to 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel. They were dropped in combination with high explosive bombs to create massive firestorms, engulfing entire city blocks and causing horrific casualties among the population. But wait until we get to the incendiaries used on Japan. Inside bombers, 75% of aircrews were in their late teens or early 20s and suffered the most horrific casualty rate of the war. More than half of them were killed on operations, 12% were killed or wounded in non-operational accidents, and 13% became prisoners of war. Around 8,000 men were killed just in training accidents before even seeing combat. Bombing missions were extremely dangerous and terrifying, where even the smallest malfunction could cost them their lives, and as you can see, it often did. Flying at high altitudes in unpressurized cabins, temperatures dropped to -50 degrees Fahrenheit, so airmen had to wear electrically heated suits and oxygen masks to stay alive. If their equipment failed, they could sustain frostbite, and if their oxygen supply was cut, they would simply fall asleep without realizing it. If no one noticed in a couple of minutes, they would never wake up. The cold was so extreme that gunners could lose their fingers just by touching the frozen metal of their machine guns without gloves, and if they were hit by shrapnel, their blood would freeze as it left their body. They had parachutes, but they weren't very reliable, and crews had to jump through narrow escape hatches, wearing bulky flight gear, all while their aircraft was falling out of control or burning. Only 25% of airmen managed to bail out and deploy their parachutes successfully, while some aircraft, like the Avro Lancaster, had an even lower survival rate of just 15% due to smaller and poorly positioned escape hatches. There are examples of airmen jumping out of burning aircraft without parachutes, preferring to die on impact. There are 2 known instances where airmen survived a fall without a parachute from over 18,000 feet, with trees and snow softening the impact. Even if you survived the hit from enemy fire, bailed out without part of the aircraft hitting you, and your parachute worked, you were now descending into enemy territory where the people your bombs had been killing don't have much sympathy for you. Around 10,000 airmen became prisoners of war, enduring interrogations, brutal treatment and conditions in POW camps for months or even years. The German flak was the most feared threat, but interceptor fighters were the ones responsible for downing the most bombers. Before the introduction of long-range escort fighters like the P-51 Mustang, bombers were on their own during the most vulnerable part of their mission. This was because early escort fighters had significantly shorter range than bombers, meaning they could only protect them for part of the journey before having to turn back. German fighters armed with 20mm cannons would swarm the bombers, trying to disable the gunners, then the engines to bring them down. This forced bombers to fly in tight formations for mutual protection, relying on their machine guns, up to 13 of them as seen on the B-17 Flying Fortress. While this slightly improved defense against fighters, it also increased vulnerability to flak, as a single well-placed shell could damage multiple aircraft in formation. The famous 88mm flak gun was fired in coordinated volleys, with shells designed to explode in proximity to enemy aircraft, scattering around 1,000 fragments in all directions. An explosion within a 30-foot radius was extremely lethal. The fragments ripped through the aluminum skin of bombers, severing control cables, fuel tanks, oil lines, and engines, while also taking out crew members. A direct hit meant instant destruction of the aircraft and everyone on board, especially if bomber was hit with its bombs still on board. Now, for the people on the ground, the situation was no better. Around 130 German cities were heavily bombed to the point of almost complete destruction, with examples like Dresden, which, despite having no real military significance, was turned into rubble, with around 30,000 people killed in just a couple of days. Between 750,000 and 1 million Germans would die in air raids, most of them women, children, and civilian men, while many others suffered due to food and medical shortages caused by intensive bombings. And if you think it couldn't get any worse, we've come to the bombing campaign in the Pacific to prove you wrong. We've all heard about the atomic bombs, but the disturbing truth is that they were not actually the biggest cause of destruction and loss of life in Japan. Here, in the final chapter of World War II, the B-29 Superfortress was the primary bomber used in the bombing of Japan, trying to force them into submission. At first, the bombing of Japan was a logistical nightmare, as it was simply too far. But after the capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the US bombers were now well within range of Japan's mainland and ready to unleash devastation on an unprecedented scale. The infamous winds at high altitudes over Japan threw bombs wildly off target and made precision bombing impossible, while factories and military targets were usually mixed with the civilian population. So, to find the best solution for this, the Americans conducted low-altitude nighttime incendiary raids that would simply destroy everything and everyone. The first full-scale firebombing raid took place on March 9, 1945, over Tokyo, and it became the deadliest air raid in history, far surpassing anything seen in Europe. In a single night, 334 B-29s dropped over 1,600 tons of incendiary bombs, like the M69, which burst into jellied gasoline, sticking to surfaces and burning at over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. These bombs ignited the highly flammable wooden Japanese houses, and the fires quickly spiraled out of control, forming a firestorm that engulfed nearly 16 square miles of Tokyo. The intense heat literally boiled the water in canals where people had jumped in, desperately trying to escape the flames. We couldn't even describe how it looked without this video being taken down from YouTube. Over 100,000 civilians were caught in the fire, more than the death toll of either Hiroshima or Nagasaki, making the Tokyo firebombing the single deadliest night of World War II. This strategy was repeated across Japan, with 67 different cities completely destroyed in firebombing raids, killing more than 500,000 Japanese civilians. And of course, because all of this just wasn't enough, On August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay dropped Little Boy, a 15-kiloton uranium bomb, on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki, finally forcing Japan to capitulate 6 days later. The two atomic bombs combined instantly killed 110,000 people upon impact, flattening entire cities. Thousands more succumbed in the following weeks, months, and years from radiation effects, which would go on to affect hundreds of thousands of people for decades after the attack. Thus, the most destructive war in human history ended beneath mushroom clouds, symbolizing the temporary end of a level of destruction never seen before or since, until we decide to do it again.